Coming to you live from Westminster, Colorado, this is Front Range Community News. I'm Serious Susan with this morning's breaking news. Hide your kids, hide your wives, or maybe at least keep them from ingesting the raw meat of local hoofed animals. If you hear this warning and think, I'll bet there's a local anthrax outbreak, you would be correct. As of this morning, there have been 3 confirmed cases of anthrax in humans in the Denver metro area. Interestingly enough, each of these 3 cases are presenting as different forms of the infection. Cutaneous, with a black and necrotic sore on the skin. Pulmonary, with fever and chills, shortness of breath, and chest pains. And gastrointestinal, also with fever and chills, a painful and swollen abdomen, and bloody vomit and diarrhea. Now, while anthrax might cause most people to think of the deadly terror attacks on government officials and news agencies in 2001, this particular outbreak has been caused by a much more benign source. Or should I say, bovine source. Local health experts have tracked the outbreak to Moo Moo Pastures, a popular farm and petting zoo in Adams County. Our camera crew takes us live to talk to the owner of Moo Moo Pastures, Jason Moo Moo.
Well, I'm in a state of shock about it all, really. You always hear about how anthrax reservoirs are in the soil and hoofed livestock animals like cattle, sheep, goats, deer, and antelopes, but you never think that it will be in your soil and in your hoofed livestock animals. Sure, anthrax spores can be found all over the world, but an infection is just so rare. How did the infection happen? Oh, well, it was just the darndest thing. I run a small business here, so I interact with every one of my customers face to face, and I remember these 3 customers very clearly. First, there was this guy, tall, dark, and handsome type, with an air of mystery about him. He only had one hand, and the other hand looked like it had been pretty freshly removed, and not by no doctor neither, judging by the state of his wound. That's right, I could see the wound, and not bound up or anything, dripping blood all over the place. I asked him if he was all right, and he told me he would be, as soon as he could pet good old Bessie. Said that cows have magic powers to restore limbs if you pet them just right. I thought about turning him away, but I figured I do run a petting zoo. What's the harm in letting him pet her? So he did, with his open wound, and seemed mighty happy about it too. Little did we know that the anthrax spores that were on Bessie's hide were entering into his body through his open wound, causing a cutaneous infection, where they then would germinate, begin to multiply, and produce toxins, leading to skin lesions, ulcers, and tissue death. The next person who came in that day seemed almost normal compared to him, just a regular old student at the nearby community college. Said she was overwhelmed by a microbiology project at school, and she came by to smell some fresh farm air and get acquainted with the cow, for stress relief purposes. Well, apparently she really wanted to smell the farm air, because as soon as she saw Bessie, she ran right up to her and buried her face in her neck, breathing deeply and all for a good long while. Maybe I should have stopped her after the 10-minute mark, but by that point, it started to feel like I was interrupting something, mighty uncomfortable. But probably not as uncomfortable as she is now that she's contracted a pulmonary anthrax infection after the spores entered into her lungs, were engulfed by immune cells, and taken to her lymph nodes to germinate and spread toxins throughout her body. The final visitor of the day really shouldn't be considered a visitor, because he wasn't no paying customer. Now, unfortunately, Bessie hadn't been feeling well for several days. She was hiding it well, but by the end of the day, she had succumbed to her illness and died. This is always an emotional event for us here at Moo Moo Pastures, and we like to do a proper open casket memorial. Well, we had set aside sweet Bessie while the carpenter was constructing the sarcophagus, and I just happened to see some movement over by where we had placed her. I came around the corner to investigate, and I saw some ne'er-do-gooder running away with one of Bessie's legs. I hear this happens on other farms occasionally, what with the price of beef these days, but it was definitely a first here at Moo Moo Pastures. I'll bet you anything that son of a gun went home, didn't process his meat correctly, and ate an undercooked steak for dinner. A free meal suddenly has an unexpected cost when the anthrax spores that were unknowingly present in Bessie's tissues germinated and produced toxins that then caused ulcers, tissue death, and bleeding in the GI tract, also known as gastrointestinal anthrax infection. Sweet Bessie's revenge. I'll tell you what, I ain't worried about getting infected myself. As someone who works closely with livestock, I've been vaccinated against infection. Had to get 5 shots over 18 months, and I still get another booster every year. All that's left to do now is get the rest of my animals vaccinated and do a thorough antimicrobial clean of the place so I can get back to what I love most, bringing people joy through petting cows.
A truly horrific and unusual story. You've heard about how the infections occurred. Now we have renowned microbiologist Smarty McScience here with us to talk a bit more in depth about this bacterium that's caused such dire infections. Smarty, what more can you tell us?
Thank you for having me, Susan. Well, first of all, these seemingly disparate illnesses are actually all caused by one bacterium, Bacillus anthracis. B. anthracis is a gram-positive bacillus aerobic bacteria that forms incredibly resilient endospores and will produce toxins when in a vegetative state that are among the most potently destructive to human cells.
Smarty, the average American audience at home wants more detail. Can you tell us anything about this microorganism's virulence factors?
Of course, and I am in no way surprised that the average American audience wants to hear these details from their local news channel. As far as virulence factors, there's always the endospores, but what B. anthracis really has going for it are its toxin subunits that come together to form two different active toxins. First, the protective antigen, a receptor-binding subunit, will bind to the receptor of a cell, and either an edema toxin subunit or lethal toxin subunit will bind to that BA, and they will both be endocytosed into the cell. Since EF and LF are both enzymatic subunits, they will then damage the cell, leading to extensive tissue death. Edema toxin will primarily target the tissues of liver and skin, whereas lethal toxin will target the smooth muscles of the heart. However, they will both attack a body's immune cells early on in the infection, and both can ultimately lead to toxicity, septicemia, and death.
That's Smarty McScience with those juicy details. Thank you, Smarty.
My pleasure, Susan.
Health officials recommend avoiding moo-moo pastures and other locales when an outbreak is actively happening, as well as avoiding contact with livestock, hides, carcasses, and undercooked meat to prevent contracting an anthrax infection. All 3 patients developed symptoms 2 to 5 days after exposure to Bessie and are now all receiving care in a Denver hospital. Care consists of an antibiotic regimen of either ciprofloxacin or doxycycline. As we all know, ciprofloxacin targets bacterial gyrase and therefore the cellular DNA of B. anthracis, whereas doxycycline binds to the 30S ribosomal unit to target bacterial protein synthesis. Hopefully, the antibiotics work and all 3 patients can get back to their unusual lives in no time. I'm Susan Sirius with Front Range Community News, signing off.